In the year 1145, whispers reached Rome. A bishop, traveling from the east, carried tales of a man unlike any other. He spoke of a king, a priest, and a warrior, Prester John. According to him, this ruler commanded an empire where Christianity thrived in the middle of a non-Christian world. At first, the story seemed like a dream. Europe was in the age of the Crusades, locked in bitter struggle with Islamic powers. A powerful ally, a Christian monarch ruling in the distant east, was exactly what they longed for. Could God have placed a savior beyond the horizon? 2 decades later, in 1165, something extraordinary happened. A letter appeared. It was addressed to the Byzantine Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, and even the Pope himself. The supposed author? Prester John, king and priest of the Indies. The letter painted a picture too magnificent to ignore. Prester John described a realm overflowing with marvels. Emerald palaces, rivers of milk and honey, mountains of gold, and beasts beyond imagination. Unicorns, griffins, and phoenixes. He claimed his empire stretched so far that it bordered both the Holy Land and the edge of paradise itself. The letter also promised something Europe desperately wanted: military salvation. Prester John wrote that his armies were vast, unstoppable, and ready to march in defense of Christianity. All he needed was contact with fellow believers in the West. Kings and popes read these words and believed them. The Crusades had drained Europe's strength, but here was hope. A hidden Christian superpower that might tilt the balance of history. But no messenger from Prester John ever arrived. No army marched to Jerusalem, yet the legend was alive, and Europe would not let it go. The letter of Prester John spread like wildfire. By the 1200s, nearly every European court had heard of him. But now came the question: where was he? At first, Europe scholars and cartographers placed Prester John in India. The reasoning was simple. India was exotic, wealthy, and mysterious. The Bible itself spoke of it as a land of spices and gold. What better place for a hidden Christian kingdom? When Crusaders fought in the Holy Land, they expected Prester John's armies to come pouring in from the east. But no ally ever appeared. Instead, Islamic dynasties grew stronger and Europe grew desperate. Then came a shock. In the early 1200s, messengers arrived from the east, Mongol envoys. They rode into Europe bearing gifts and letters from Genghis Khan's successors. To the stunned Europeans, these strange horsemen seemed like they could be Prester John's people. After all, the Mongols were sweeping through Asia, toppling empires with terrifying ease. Could this unstoppable force be the Christian kingdom they had been waiting for? Rumors spread that Prester John was not just a king, but a Mongol ruler. Some even believed that Genghis Khan himself was Prester John, or his descendant. Hope surged. Perhaps the great Mongol Empire, stretching from China to Europe's doorstep, was secretly Christian. Pope Innocent IV and other leaders sent friars and envoys eastward, carrying letters, gifts, and offers of alliance. If the Mongols were Prester John's people, they could help Europe crush Islam once and for all. But those hopes were quickly shattered. The envoys discovered the truth. The Mongols were not Christian saviors. They were conquerors demanding submission. Their leaders showed no interest in protecting Christendom. They wanted to dominate it. Still, the legend of Prester John refused to die. Instead, his kingdom shifted again on Europe's maps. If not in India and not among the Mongols, then where? By the late 1200s, all eyes turned to Africa. Traders returning from the Red Sea told stories of a Christian kingdom deep within the highlands of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian church traced its roots back to the earliest centuries of Christianity, and it remained strong even as Islam spread across North Africa. For Europeans, this was electrifying. A Christian kingdom in Africa? Could this finally be Prester John? Letters, maps, and rumors shifted Prester John's empire southward, into the mysterious land of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. For the next 300 years, kings and explorers would chase shadows across deserts and oceans, all in search of the phantom monarch who promised salvation. But every time they thought they were close, the truth slipped further away. The legend had become unstoppable. Prester John was no longer just a king. He was hope itself, a dream Europe refused to let go. By the late 1300s, the myth of Prester John had shifted yet again. Europe had scoured India, and the Mongols had proven themselves conquerors, not saviors. But in Africa, the whispers grew louder. Traders returning from the Red Sea told of a powerful Christian kingdom deep in the highlands of Ethiopia. This was no myth. Ethiopia had been Christian since the 4th century, long before most of Europe. Its emperors traced their lineage back to the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. They were real rulers commanding armies, churches, and trade routes. To the Europeans, this was enough. Ethiopia must be the kingdom of Prester John. Who else could it be? By the 1400s, the Portuguese took up the hunt. Hungry to expand their influence and choke off Islamic power, they launched voyages around Africa's coasts. Their goal was twofold: reach the spice trade of India and make contact with Prester John's empire. In 1402, a Portuguese fleet carried letters addressed to him. They didn't know where he was, but they were determined to find him. By the mid-1400s, their ships had rounded the Cape Verde Islands, pushing further down Africa's Atlantic coast. Every port they touched, they asked the same question: where is the kingdom of Prester John? Finally, word reached them. In the highlands of East Africa, there lived a mighty Christian king. Portuguese explorers set their sights on Ethiopia. In 1441, Ethiopian envoys actually traveled to Europe, meeting the Pope in Florence. For a moment, the legend felt alive. The Ethiopians were astonished by how Europeans spoke of Prester John, a name they had never heard before. To them, they were simply the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, led by their own emperors. But Europe refused to let go. In their minds, the Ethiopians were the descendants of Prester John, the final piece of the puzzle. By the late 1400s, when Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa to India, the myth was woven into every expedition. Portuguese kings instructed their captains: find the land of Prester John, secure his alliance. Together, crush the Islamic powers that stood between Europe and Asia. But every time Europeans thought they had reached him, disappointment followed. Ethiopia was indeed Christian, but it was not the golden empire of emerald palaces and rivers of gems described in the legendary letter. It was a kingdom, yes, but poor, besieged by enemies, and struggling to hold its ground. Still, Europeans clung to the fantasy. To admit Prester John was only Ethiopia was to kill a dream that had guided them for centuries. So they stretched the myth further, painting the Ethiopian emperors as heirs of a once greater kingdom. Prester John, they said, must have been real, but his empire had faded, diminished from the glory described in the old letter. And so the search continued. The 1400s would end with Europeans pushing further into the oceans, westward toward the Americas and eastward toward India. But always, beneath the sails and prayers, lingered the same hope. Somewhere out there, Prester John was waiting. The 1500s marked a turning point. For nearly 400 years, Europe had chased shadows: Prester John in India, Prester John among the Mongols, Prester John in Africa. But now, the Portuguese were determined to settle the question once and for all. Armed with caravels, cannons, and relentless ambition, they sailed further than any European had gone before. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. But even as Portugal celebrated, the hunt for Prester John remained alive. Their navigators had heard enough from Arab traders and Red Sea pilots to believe that Ethiopia was the answer. By 1520, a Portuguese diplomatic mission finally reached the Ethiopian highlands. For the first time, Europeans stood face to face with the Christian empire they had dreamed of for centuries. And what they found was both wondrous and disappointing. The emperor they met was not named Prester John. He was Lebna Dengel, a monarch ruling a proud but embattled kingdom. His palace was not built of emeralds. His lands were not overflowing with rivers of jewels or beasts from paradise. Instead, they saw a rugged land, carved with mountains and valleys, where churches stood proudly but armies struggled against relentless enemies. The Ethiopians welcomed the Portuguese warmly. They too were fighting for survival. Surrounded by Muslim states and constantly at war, they needed allies as desperately as Europe dreamed of finding them. But the illusion of Prester John crumbled quickly. The Portuguese envoys realized Ethiopia was not the mythical empire of legend. Its armies were brave but small. Its lands were fertile but not boundless. Its riches were real, but modest compared to the exaggerated tales Europe had repeated for centuries. Still, the Portuguese refused to abandon the myth completely. To them, Ethiopia had to be Prester John's kingdom, even if it no longer looked like the Golden Empire described in the legendary letter of 1165. They told themselves that Ethiopia was the last surviving fragment of a once great Christian realm. In truth, the Ethiopians were puzzled. They had never heard the name Prester John. Their emperors traced their lineage to Solomon, not to some distant priest-king. Yet the Europeans persisted, calling their monarch Prester John in their letters and records. The meeting between Portugal and Ethiopia had lasting consequences. The two Christian powers forged an alliance. Portuguese musketeers fought alongside Ethiopian warriors against their enemies. Jesuit missionaries followed, hoping to bring Ethiopia under the wing of the Catholic Church. But beneath these exchanges lay disappointment. For Europe, Prester John had been a symbol of salvation, a dream that promised to change history. Standing in Ethiopia, the Portuguese realized the truth. The dream was gone. What remained was a kingdom fighting for survival, not a mythical empire destined to save Christendom. Yet even as the reality became clear, the legend refused to die. Maps continued to show Prester John's kingdom. Stories continued to circulate, and back in Europe, the name still carried weight, as if admitting the truth was too painful to bear. Prester John had been found, and yet he had never existed. By the 1600s, Europe had changed. The age of exploration had brought knowledge of the world's oceans, continents, and kingdoms. Maps had become more accurate. Yet even with these advances, the name of Prester John still echoed through Europe. For nearly 500 years, kings, popes, and explorers had chased a dream. They had searched India, scoured Central Asia, and crossed deserts and oceans in pursuit of a Christian savior who would aid Christendom against Islam. And now the truth was undeniable. Prester John was a myth. Portuguese expeditions to Ethiopia had revealed the kingdom's reality. It was Christian, yes, but far from the fantastical empire described in the legendary letter of 1165. Its rulers were mortal, its armies finite, and its treasures modest. The rivers of gems, the emerald palaces, the unicorns, they had never existed. Cartographers began to update their maps. Prester John's empire, once placed across India, the Mongol territories, and Africa, gradually faded from Europe's geographic imagination. By the mid-1600s, most scholars recognized that the kingdom was a story, not a place. Letters, old maps, and travelers' tales were analyzed and debunked. The age of myth was over, yet the legend had left its mark. For centuries, Prester John had driven exploration, inspired diplomacy, and even influenced military strategy. European navigators had ventured further into unknown seas in his name. European rulers had dreamed of alliances that might never have existed. Even in Ethiopia, the story lingered, though faintly. Europeans continued to call their emperors Prester John, but the Ethiopians themselves never used the name. To them, it had always been their land, their faith, their history. By the end of the 1600s, Prester John's kingdom vanished from maps completely. It became a tale of curiosity, a story told by scholars, historians, and chroniclers of legends. But the impact of the myth endured. From 1145 to the 1600s, Prester John had existed in the imagination of Europe. He had never wielded power, led armies, or ruled cities, but he had shaped centuries of thought, exploration, and ambition. The kingdom that never was had fueled the voyages that brought continents together, that opened trade routes, and that forever changed the world. Prester John had fooled Europe not by force but by hope, and in that, his legend was real.